Welcome to Clipper Glory, the dawn of ocean air transport. I'm John Hill, Assistant Director of Aviation at SFO Museum. One day, it was impossible to buy a ticket to fly across an ocean, and the next day, it was possible to have the hopes and aspirations of this nation, raise up on the wings of these silver flying boats. Really captivated the world's imagination, and what we're celebrating is the very first passenger flight in a fixed-wing aircraft across any ocean in a scheduled service. George William Taylor, who went by Bill, was one of the engineers Pan Am hired to build its mid-Pacific bases. Throughout this podcast, you'll be hearing excerpts from his memoirs.
When Pan American decided to broaden its operation in the Pacific, their studies showed a fortunate geographical fact, namely, that islands under U.S. control formed convenient stopping places across to Manila. These were Hawaii, Midway, Wake, and Guam. 3 M130 flying boats, designed especially for this route, were ordered from the Glenn L. Martin Company.
The flying boats that were used for these passenger services were referred to as clipper ships, flying clipper ships.
They were to be named China Clipper, Philippine Clipper, and Hawaii Clipper.
Flying boat captain Arthur Hillier is a 38-year veteran of Pan Am.
Well, the Martin M130 is common terminology to call any M130 a China Clipper, a generic name sort of a thing.
I think there was a true dedication of spirit to this really fascinating time in human transportation, and Clipper Glory was a very fitting catchphrase. In these podcasts, you'll hear the story of Clipper Glory, told by the Pan Am employees who built, flew, and maintained the airplanes, as well as the people who created and worked on the island bases that were stopovers on the Pacific route. In the early 1930s, it could take 17 to 24 hours to fly from New York to San Francisco, let's say, and that could involve anywhere from 11 to 17 stops. So flying across an ocean was still a dream. This one company sort of stood out above all others in setting its sights on flying across the Pacific Ocean on a regular and reliable and scheduled basis, and that company was Pan American Airways. Pan American put an announcement in the window of their offices at 427 Post Street. A round-trip fare from San Francisco to Hong Kong was $1,937, which is more than $30,000 in today's equivalent. A gentleman named R.F. Bradley, who was an employee of Standard Oil who was working in their aviation division, bought ticket number 1. The other 6 who were on that first flight include Wilbur May, who was the head of the May Company, a woman named Clara Adams of Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, one of the world's first frequent flyers, Colonel Charles Bartley from Chicago, a local capitalist and executive at Lockheed Airplane Company named Thomas Fortune Ryan, Alfred Bennett of Hightstown, New Jersey, who was in the airplane sales business, and Zeta Averill, who was a world traveler and aviation enthusiast from Aberdeen, Washington. It was quite a mixture of people from different stripes and different walks of life who just walked up as we would today and bought a ticket. San Francisco and the Bay in particular provided the kind of terminus that was needed for these flying boat fleets because they had to land and take off on water. And San Francisco is about 160 miles closer to Honolulu than Los Angeles. So San Francisco became the natural location for this by virtue of the geography. Arthur Hillier, flying boat captain, flew for Pan Am for 38 years.
People would actually come to Treasure Island just to see the departure once a week of a China Clipper going off to Manila and Hong Kong. We'd file down to the aircraft, 2 abreast, captain, first officer, and then subsequent crew members right down the line. It would march in step down the stairs and down the ramp and onto the airplane. It was quite a show.
Sam Tormina served Pan Am for 38 years as steward, purser, and flight director.
When the passengers came on down, we'd greet them, and then once we got all the passengers on the airplane, close the door, one of us would run upstairs to the cabin and say, the cabin is secure and we're ready for takeoff. The airplane is tied up to the dock. There's people out there to take the ropes off and push the airplane out and get it out into the lagoon, and we're on our way to Hawaii.
The bridge actually wasn't complete in 1935 in October when we had our first China Clipper flight from Alameda, and it couldn't get over the Bay Bridge, so it went under it. And the Navy fighter pilots that were escorting that plane, piloted by Music, our chief pilot at the time, they shook their heads and followed him right under the bridge and out over the bay.
In every endeavor such as this, there are always your group of pioneers who do it first. The flying boat captains were and are often compared to the astronauts of today. They were a new breed of professional aviator. Music had a very interesting past. He started as a barnstormer.
He was Pan American itself, practically, was one of the 5 originators of the company and the master pilot for the entire company. The most canny and intelligent mind in the aviation world.
Flying was sort of a seat-of-the-pants affair back then. Pan American really regimented and professionalized the occupation. The route across the Pacific had to be broken up into flyable segments, and obviously the Hawaii sector, being 2,400 miles, was the most daunting. Pan Am flying boat captain Ken Beer.
The airplane could make it if the wind wasn't against them, with some passengers and some mail.
There were times when the flying boats would take off for Hawaii, and they would get near the halfway point and have to turn around and come back.
Vernon Smith was a longtime Pan Am flight mechanic.
Meteorology was very primitive in those days.
The meteorologist calculated what the wind would be and what the length of the flight would be. And more than once we figured out that it's marginal. So we'd go as far as it was safe, and as I put it casually, we were approaching half of our gas, and we hadn't had half of our trip. We better come back.
Flying boat captain Arthur Hillier is a 38-year veteran of Pan Am.
The pilot taking off would strictly watch the airspeed and the horizon, and at a certain speed, let's say 60 or 70 knots, you would try to get on the step, that is, bring the bow up so that the hull was more out of the water than in the water, and then you were flat and level and skimming along until you reached takeoff speed. You'd have takeoff power on until you lifted off. 2 minutes was probably average. 2 minutes, full power. Roaring engines, noisy, and you could feel the waves hit the bow and the hull right under you, skim along. It was fun. You just hoped to get enough altitude to get over the Golden Gate Bridge.
Dorothy Mclain, Dot to her friends, wrote about her very first flight to Hawaii in July 1937. She and her husband Mac Mclain were en route to their new post, running the hotel at Pan Am's base on Midway Island.
We are passing over the Great Golden Gate Bridge now and heading toward the open sea.
Of course, you have a lot of fuel on this airplane, so you can't go real high real fast. It takes hours to get up to 8,000 or 9,000 feet. You stay at 2,000 feet a long period, and then when you burn so much gas off, then you go maybe another 2,000 feet. And the plane is still pretty heavy, so you stay there at that altitude until you burn enough gas to get at your cruising altitude.
The California shore has entirely faded from view, and I can see nothing but ocean and sky. The flight steward, Mr. Parker, tells me that we are at our ceiling now, unless we encounter clouds. I am perfectly satisfied at this altitude. There is a very slight rocking motion, but it does not bother us. The 3,200 horses who are pulling us are kicking up quite a roar, but I feel as normal and safe as if I were on the ground.
These little compartments were made up with a table and a bench arrangement for dining, with the full service white linen, china, and sterling.
Mac is in the galley with the steward being shown around, and I think he will help him serve afternoon tea and dinner. 9:30 p.m. It was a delicious dinner, and the cookies turned out to be peak-freen biscuits. A real treat for me, as I have not had any of them since leaving England 18 years ago.
And then those same rooms would be made up in a bedroom for the night, where they could lie down and have a good sleep.
We will arrive in Honolulu tomorrow morning about 6, so I want to get a good night's sleep in order to be up early. From the looks of the berths, that will be easily accomplished. Suddenly, looking down through a rift in the clouds, we see directly below us the beautiful island of Oahu, brilliantly green and studded with red-roofed houses. We immediately began to lose altitude at an alarming rate of speed. The plane nosed down at such an angle that I, who had been kneeling on the floor at one of the lounge windows, was lurched off balance and sent sprawling on the floor.
But on your landing, you're real light now. You burned all this fuel, and this airplane is very light. So when you first hit the water, it's just like ripping the metal off of it. It's a sound that swish, and if you got a hose and put it against metal and turn it on full force, that rattling noise that it makes, until it lays it flat and flatter on the water, that noise disappears. Now it's shh. You get that noise out of it real light.
We taxied in slowly to the dock in Pearl Harbor and finally came to a stop. The hatch was unfastened, and we climbed up the steps and out into the warm Hawaiian sunshine. My ears still hurt dreadfully from the descent, but I was not too deaf to hear the beautiful strains of Aloha being played by a native trio on the veranda of the Pan Air Base building. Each passenger is presented with a colourful flower lei, and the air is heavy with the fragrance of hibiscus, which is the official flower of the islands.
Many people were put up at the Royal Hawaiian or the Halekulani hotels right at Waikiki Beach. You had an opportunity to maybe try your hand at surfboarding or take a drive up the Pali. And you'd have to get to bed early because it'd be a very early call the next morning to get back to the dock and board your flying boat again for the next segment of the flight. Be sure to check back for the next segment of Clipper Glory, the dawn of ocean air transport, Hawaii to Wake Island via Midway. SFO Museum extends its appreciation to all the interviewees excerpted in these oral histories, and to Richard Mclain with a donation to our collection of his mother Dorothy Mclain's letters.
This is an Earprint production.